This is The Law Show on CISL 650. Now back to the show.
Stirling Faux with you, the Redhead and the Diner coming up at noon. We're talking immigration law with Gordon Maynard, Rudy Kischer, and Alex Stojicevic from Maynard Kischer Stojicevic, an immigration and citizenship law firm here in Vancouver. They're online at vancouverlaw.ca. All the contact information for my guests is available should you choose to give them a call. Wanted to ask you very quickly, who's a typical client of MKS? Is it a person wanting information about immigration law? Or is it a company wanting to hire someone that's, well, a foreigner and going to have some difficulty getting in? Rudy, who gives you the call more often than not?
I would say that we get our typical client is an employer that is looking to sort of move somebody here so that they've got a position to fill, whether it's a position of a CEO or a tradesperson, and they're saying, they've looked at the government red tape and saying, well, how do we get this person here fast? But
sure.
We also get people that are, living in Canada, and they've been working here on a work permit, and they're like, well, it's time for me to sort of change my status, become a permanent resident, and how do I do that? And they give us a call.
Interesting stuff. A lot of changes, Alex, you were saying, since you began the firm a dozen or more years ago. And, of course, we've discussed already at considerable length. More changes due in 10 days on January the 1st. Talk to us about how the whole the theater of immigration to Canada has changed. Now it's multiple ministries, multiple responsibilities. It's not just the Department of Immigration anymore. That's where you go, that's where you get processed, and Bob's your uncle. It's different now.
Yeah, exactly. And really my career choice was poor. As I tell my children, ask me, would you do immigration law again? And if you didn't, what would you do? And I tell them, it's simple. I would never do immigration law again. I would become a contractor for the federal government making uniforms, because they change departments so often and move people around so much. You'd have an endless supply of work, and it's the best gig around. I think that's what I would do the next time. Let me give you an example. When Canada Border Services was created, they pulled the enforcement officers out of Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, which existed for 2 years, got new uniforms in those 2 years, by the way, moved half of them into Canada Revenue just as the new uniforms for CCRA was coming from the Quebec contractor, and then put the rest of them in Canada Border Services, creating yet another set of new uniforms. Those people used to all be part of Citizenship and Immigration Canada.
Right.
But those are two completely different ministries now. They have an operations mandate that is the same act, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, but they're two wholly different departments with different
mandates.
Different mandates. Thank you. I mean, in the sense of Canada Border Services, they're there to protect the border and to enforce the law.
Right.
Citizenship and Immigration Canada is more designed around the policies around immigration. These are fundamentally different, and now the average person who interacts with this system has to deal with both of them.
Okay.
At the same time, if an employer wants to interface with the system, his employee will have to interface with these two departments, as well as, very likely, a third department, the Employment Skills and Development Canada Ministry. It used to be called the Human Resources and Skills Development Canada Ministry.
Manpower back in the day.
Or Canada Manpower.
Yeah, right.
And by the way, back then, when it was Canada Manpower, immigration was part of their department.
For goodness sake.
So, like I say, uniform making, it's the future. Anyway.
And if I can add to the comment about the creation of CBSA and the splitting responsibilities there, it used to be that Citizenship and Immigration Canada was both the facilitation arm and the enforcement arm.
Okay.
And so they would bring people in, and at the same time, if they had to deal with the people in an enforcement aspect, they would do that as well. Now, immigration is a very human business. Sometimes you have both arms looking at the same individual. But at least when it was all under Citizenship and Immigration, those two arms were attached to the same body.
The right arm would know what the left was doing.
And so you could make a reasonable decision. You got to decide, what are you going to do?
Right.
Now, CBSA is purely enforcement. Citizenship and Immigration is purely facilitation. And when somebody's caught between the two of them, those two arms aren't attached to the same body. And that makes it harder to get a reasonable discretionary decision made.
Right.
And I think when you look at the border, and we've talked about this in our office, is the CBSA, which controls the border, the Canadian Border Services Agency.
Right.
before 2002, there was an immigration department. The department was actually at the border, and they dealt with the people coming in.
Right, sure.
So now they're one agency together, and what has happened in that sort of, I think, turf war between, the three departments that were at the border, there was agriculture at the border, there was immigration at the border, and customs has won. And so customs, which is used to dealing with things and not people, has taken over the border. And I think when we talk about that heart, or a little bit of subjectivity, a little bit of discretion, I think because customs has taken over, I think you've lost that discretion at the border. And the result of that is you've got the department being totally enforcement minded at the border, making it much more harder to get sort of reasonable decisions.
We don't want to paint everybody with the same brush.
Yeah.
You are going to find people who can make good decisions and reasonable decisions. It's just harder now than it was before.
The culture's changed.
The culture has
Customs
changed, yeah.
did not have the same type of judicial review oversight, because stuff generally has less rights than people do.
Yeah.
There was never the same judicial oversight over customs as there was in immigration. And the culture of customs, by taking over, is one that is not as used to judicial oversight, and as a result of that, you've seen the problems people have had.
And another problem is the training, the amount of time they have for training, because now you've got one individual who before used to just do immigration.
Sure.
Now he's got to do immigration, he's got to understand customs, and he's got to understand agriculture and enforcement.
Right.
And so therefore his understanding immigration, I think, has decreased.
I wanted to ask you, because you've just gone to great lengths many times over since we've begun this conversation, to describe in detail the unbelievable amount of change that has occurred in immigration procedures in Canada. And I wonder, and I'd like to go around the table on this one, I wonder, since 2001, how much of that homeland security type mentality is being used as an excuse, perhaps, or is in fact a reality in our immigration system. We've changed because we're a little more afraid of what outsiders can do to us if we let them in. Is there any validity to that, Gordon?
Oh, there's partial truth in everything, isn't there? Nothing's black and white. I mean, you look at that terrible incident that occurred in Ottawa with that fellow who shot the soldier at the memorial.
Mm-hmm.
And how quick were some people to jump on that as a terrorist act, as opposed to the act of a really distressed individual.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the truth there? I mean, there's people who are going to paint it one way or the other way, depending on where their leanings are.
Sure.
You know? I look at the change that occurred in the border before 2000. When I was young, when I was a kid going through the U.S.-Canada border, when you came up to the vehicle booth, the officer in the booth had a white shirt, a tie, slacks. Now they've got flak jacket, CBSA,
right,
guns,
yeah.
You know, this is how our world has changed.
Right. So I thought, Alex, it would be a fair question, because all security in the Western world has changed as a result of 9/11, and much of it, particularly in the States, is still, I mean, they're going crazy down there, and I wonder how much of that is seeped across the border.
Much. A lot of it is seeped across. You have to take a look at first what they know about you at the border now, right? The phenomenon of the last 5 or 6 years that we've seen with increased frequency is because Canada and the U.S. have put more and more of their criminal information on the same database, which both sides have access to.
True, yeah.
Now people are being stopped with convictions from the 60s, from the 70s, and saying, no, you're inadmissible to Canada. And the fellow's like, well, I've been here 100 times. I'm just going to Whistler for the weekend.
Sure.
No, you can't go to Whistler. You're inadmissible because of your 1970 DUI. And people have to go deal with this stuff now.
Now,
That's been a practical impact of all of this information they have at their fingertips, is they can find out a lot more about people than they used to be.
Do you get calls from distressed people, Americans, who are at the border going, I can't get in.
All the time.
Help!
All the time.
Oh, is that right?
That's a big issue.
It's a big issue.
All right. Okay.
A
And it goes
DUI,
both
a DUI
ways.
in the States makes you inadmissible to Canada.
Isn't that interesting? I did not know that.
Yeah.
Rudy, what do you think about this homeland security mentality stuff? Am I overplaying that hand?
No, I don't think you're overplaying it at all. I think there are great people at CBSA, that do a good job, but I think there has been a shift towards enforcement, unfortunately. For an example that comes to mind is I had a client that called me, total panic, a new client. His wife had been arrested. They'd come into the home with guns drawn to arrest his wife, and he was like, well, you can calm down, relax. My wife is here. What's the problem? And she was an overstay, so she was in the country illegally, been here too long, but no criminal record at all. My client is a paraplegic, can't get out of bed in the morning without the help of his wife.
Okay.
Right? And
Right.
the caregiver takes 2 people to get him out of the bed.
All right.
They've been living together in the same house for 7 years. The woman is not a flight risk.
Right,
It's never
right.
been reported by immigration.
Sure, sure.
They locked her up. They locked her up for 3 days. I go to the hearing and I think, okay, I'm going to, the officers, had a warrant. They had to enforce her. They figured they had to do it. I'll get some reasonable, response. I go to the talker and I'm like, well, can we get them released? They've been living in the same plot. The guy's a paraplegic. He's not exactly a flight risk.
Right. Yeah.
The response was, no, we need we're going to need a bond here posted, etc. They may take off, etc. And that totally, it hit me then that how big the change had been, because, for the years of practice before, you would have, talk to your colleague across the across the bench and said, okay, what's reasonable here? Can we release these people? They're obviously not a flight risk. The guy's a paraplegic. Meanwhile, the wife is locked up. The guy can't get out of bed.
Sure, yeah.
And we're going to keep her detained.
Right.
I was totally shocked.
Did you get the guy released?
Yeah,
The
we got him
wife
out.
released?
Yeah, we got her released and eventually landed.
When I started in law, in this area of law 25 years ago, an officer told me, he said, this is a simple job. You throw the bad guys out, you let the good guys in.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
It's a simple job.
It seems that way.
Just be reasonable about it. Have reasonable laws. Apply them reasonably.
Okay, so 25 years ago, that made perfect sense to you.
Yeah.
How distorted is the system now relative to that very innocent analysis 25 years ago?
Too many hard and fast rules now. Not enough discretion anymore.
We're talking immigration law on this edition of The Law Show. Our guests are Gordon Maynard, Rudy Kischer, and Alex Stojicevic. They are immigration and citizenship lawyers here in Vancouver. Well, we had approval of the Site C Dam a couple of days ago here in British Columbia. And, of course, there's that big LNG project hanging over Prince Rupert or somewhere up there. We're going to talk foreign workers when we return.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CISL 650.